Hello, I'm Stephen Fagan, curator of the sixth floor museum at Dealey Plaza. Our institution's ongoing oral history project explores the history and culture of the 1960s, as well as the life, death, and legacy of President John F. Kennedy. This year, to celebrate Martin Luther King Day and Black History Month, we are pleased to present Voices from the Civil Rights Movement, a special series of recent oral history interviews with 1960s activists. In these intimate, detailed one-on-one conversations, an outstanding group of storytellers share powerful memories from several key moments of the movement, including the Montgomery bus boycott, freedom rides, the March on Washington, Mississippi Freedom Summer, the Selma to Montgomery March, and the Scope Project of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We hope that these remarkable, relevant stories will spark conversation and build bridges of understanding and communication between generations. Please keep in mind that these are full, free-flowing oral history interviews. In addition to moments of technical difficulties, there may be harsh language and graphic descriptions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know would like to share memories of the 1960s or articulate how President Kennedy has impacted your life, please contact us at oralhistory@jfk.org. We continue to record conversations year-round as part of this ongoing archival initiative, and we believe that everyone has a story. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy these voices from the civil rights movement.
And sir, at the start of these recordings, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves with their full name, date and place of birth, and maybe just a little background about your early life to get started.
My name is Rodney Lawrence Hurst. I was born March 2nd, 1944 in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm 77. I am a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a widower, a cancer survivor, an Air Force veteran, and the author of 3 books, award-winning books, about Black history and civil rights history. Currently working on a civil rights conference, Jacksonville's inaugural civil rights conference in February of next year. I go quite a bit up and down the East Coast. Occasionally I get west about Black history and civil rights and racism.
Very good, and a very relevant topic to be talking about in these modern times. And it's a great pleasure to have you here with us to share your story from the early 1960s. Maybe you could take me back to your childhood and tell me a little bit about your grandmother and really your first awareness of racism.
My grandmother's father was white. My grandmother and her brother and her 3 sisters looked white. But my grandmother considered herself Black. When I was very young, I would travel with my grandmother back and forth between Jacksonville and Aiken, South Carolina. And because there was such a stark contrast between me and her as we traveled together, Blacks on the Greyhound bus as we traveled naturally assumed that I worked for her, and certainly that she was not my grandmother, my blood grandmother. Spent most of my early childhood being immersed in signs that said Negro or colored, water fountains that said colored and white, waiting rooms, irrespective of where, were always segregated. They were colored and white. Schools were segregated. Supplies and books and other materials, the furniture in Black schools, though they were not supposed to have been marked or embedded with someone's initial carved into the furniture or names in books. They almost always were. And I started school at age 5 and I got skipped. So I'm like 2 years chronologically behind those in my class. But still, that did not change the fact that during elementary school, I graduated from elementary school at age 10. So now I'm going into junior high school, but still I'm dealing with, as a young Black boy, all of the ravages of a segregated society with all of the questions that pertain thereto and very few answers. At age 11, my family moved from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, and I had to transfer from one segregated Black junior high school to another segregated Black junior high school. And at the school I transferred to, I met Mr. Rutledge Henry Pearson, who was an 8th grade American history teacher who would not teach American history from the slanted and racist viewpoints of white textbook authors and historians who only saw fit in the textbook approved for his Negro American history class in this Negro junior high school as part of the Negro division of the Duval County public school system. That approved textbook for Negro students only had the names of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington in the book, as if they were the only 2 Blacks that made salient contributions to American society. So Mr. Pearson told us to leave that textbook at home. And he taught us American history outside of what was included in that textbook. So we started writing letters to Jackie Robinson and Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley and Althea Gibson, John Hope Franklin, Daisy Bates. And when we got responses back, we would have to do book report on those responses, type double space. We could not type. That did not make any difference to Mr. Pearson. For these 8th grade class members, we still had to find a typewriter to type up the response to our letters and what was involved in our sending the letters. And we put those typewritten responses up around the room. And even though Negro History Week started 30 years earlier, 1926, by Carter G. Woodson, it was Negro History Week every day in Mr. Pearson's class. I did my first book report on Toussaint Louverture. The name of the book was The Slave Who Freed Haiti. And of course, Toussaint Louverture led the only successful slave revolt in this hemisphere. So my formative years were unique. They were very blessed. Before age 16, I had met Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, Roy Wilkins, Daisy Bates, Harry Belafonte. I've been involved in a lot of different experiences. At a place on the East Coast, right out from Beaufort, South Carolina, the St. Helena Islands, Frogmore. St. Helena Islands were a group of islands owned by Quakers. And in the middle of those islands, on one of the key islands, was the Penn Center, Penn Center. And at the Penn Center, I met Marion Barry, who was the first chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I met Julian Bond. I met Stokely Carmichael, Diane Nash, James Bevel, Chuck McDew. All of these persons who later became civil rights personalities well before they were personalities. Graduated from high school, led the sit-in demonstrations, attacked downtown after 2 weeks of demonstrating by 200 whites with axe handles and baseball bats. Decided to go to college in Jacksonville, was going to stay there for 4 years until the clerk of the draft board let it be known that I was going to be drafted. That would be, she was going to make sure that I got out of Jacksonville. So instead of my waiting on a draft letter from her, I joined the Air Force and was eventually stationed at Carswell Air Force Base at age 17.
I know that that's going to take us into the morning of the assassination in 1963. I would like to talk a little bit more about your activism in Jacksonville, because it really is extraordinary, and I know you've written extensively on that. You were quite young when you led the NAACP Youth Council. Maybe you can talk about how you rose to that leadership position at such a young age.
Well, in Mr. Pearson's class, in addition to telling us, slamming the book down on the desk and telling us to leave the book at home, he also had some sayings which resonated with me. He said, freedom is not free. You're not a part of the solution, then you are a part of the problem. And he encouraged all of us to join his 8th grade American history class and his 9th grade civics class. And I took both classes from him in 8th and 9th grade. I joined the Youth Council NAACP at age 11 in his 8th grade class, or at the invitation of Mr. Pearson in that 8th grade American history class. Youth Council meetings were extensions of American history and civics, with him spending time acquainting us with other things going on at the time in the country, the Brown decision, what was happening in Little Rock, what was happening at the national level, what was happening with Thurgood Marshall. 1958, I think it was 58 or 59, I'm pretty sure it was 58. I'm sitting in a restaurant, I'm 14, sitting in a restaurant with Mr. Pearson and 2 other members of the Youth Council. This restaurant was, Black restaurant, was right next to the NAACP's office. And in walks Earl Johnson, who was the NAACP's attorney, local attorney in Jacksonville, assigned to handle NAACP cases. And right behind Earl Johnson, walking into this restaurant next to the NAACP's office, was Thurgood Marshall. I recognized Thurgood Marshall. I did not recognize the lady with them, who was Constance Baker Motley, who was the only female a part of the Brown decision legal team, who was president of Manhattan Borough later, became the first Black female appointed to the federal bench. Fast forward to 1960, after Axe Handle Saturday, after we had set in for 2 weeks at the downtown lunch counters in Jacksonville, downtown department stores that either had 2 lunch counters, had one. If they had 1 lunch counter, blacks had to go down to the end of the lunch counter, had to stand and order. And when the white waitress came over to take your order, you stood while you were giving the order, you paid for the food, and you stood waiting on your food to be returned to you. And sometimes if it was hot food, it was not hot by the time you got it back. Other department stores in downtown Jacksonville had 2 lunch counters, 1 white lunch counter, 1 colored lunch counter. When we started sitting in, excuse me, at Woolworth's department store downtown, Woolworth had 2 lunch counters. You walked into the store, to the front of the store, and looked to the left, you would see a lunch counter that had 84 seats. The lunch counter area was punctuated with bright windows, nice signs, all very conducive to eating, whether you were a shopper at Woolworth or not. The colored lunch counter at Woolworth was in the back of the store, past the shoes and the clothes and the animal food and the aquarium supplies and the lampshades and the mirrors, garden implements. At the very back of the store was a 15 counter colored lunch counter that you could not see when you walked into Woolworth's. Now, Woolworth, as other white department stores, invited black shoppers in to spend their money. But these stores only wanted black shoppers to spend their money where they wanted them to spend their money. And we said that was insulting. And we used those white segregated lunch counters, emblematic of the segregation in the South and the racism in the South. We use those lunch counters as vehicles to demonstrate our opposition to segregation and racism. The title of my first book, It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, simply means we did not sit in at lunch counters just to eat a sandwich and to drink a beverage. But because of the insulting nature of those lunch counters, we sat in at those lunch counters again to show our disdain for and our opposition to racism and segregation, and our support of our own Black human dignity and respect. We sat in for 2 weeks. We had a white student from Florida State University to join us during one of the demonstrations. And whites who had started standing behind us yelling the racial epithets of the day then, which are the racial epithets of the day today, upset because they could not get their fresh lunches at Woolworth's. – Redirected their scorn and their epithets from us as Black persons sitting in at their heretofore white lunch counter to this white student who joined us. So we were the niggers and the jungle bunny, and he became the nigger-loving racial agitator. One day, some construction workers came, white construction workers came into Woolworth. They were building a bank building right across the street. And they came into Woolworths, and I am convinced, as are others who are still with us today who participated in the sit-ins, that they were prepared to grab him off of the lunch counter seats to do whatever. And some Black teenagers in Woolworths, as onlookers, I mean, it got to be a show, if you will, Blacks sitting in this vestige of white comfortability, demonstrating against the colored and the white sign. Noticing what was happening, they walked over and said to me, "Rodney, what's happening?" I said, "Take Parker with you." Because it was obvious they were standing, Woolworth had bays that came out. And so a waitress could serve like 7 or 8 people in these bays, like oval, very small and narrow ovals. But it was very convenient to serve several people in a short space. So we were sitting at one of the bays and Parker was sitting next to me, or one person over from me. So I told him to go with them, and they put a circle around Parker, formed a circle, put him in the middle, and walked him out of the store. I am convinced something would have happened to him that day had they not done that. August 27th, 1960, Mr. Pearson found out there were whites passing out free axe handles and baseball bats in Heman Park, named then for a Confederate soldier from St. Augustine. It is now named for James Weldon Johnson. They had a sign up next to a station wagon then that said free axe handles. I found out 20 years later, 40 years later, in 2000, that the Klan had held a meeting in a local Jacksonville hotel. I found that out from an FBI informant who I did not meet until August 27th of 2000, when we had the 40th commemoration of Axe Handle Saturday. And he explained to me that he was an informant and he was in the Klan, and he wrote his report for his FBI handler, and the FBI handler put the report on the desk of Dale Carson, who was a former FBI agent, now the sheriff of Duval County, only to have that report intercepted by one of Dale Carson's lieutenants, who was a member of the Klan. Also met the adjutant general in 2000 of the Florida National Guard. And when he was a Guard member or Guard officer in 1960, the National Guard was on standby in both St. Augustine and in Camp Blanding on the outskirts of Jacksonville, because they knew something was going to happen. They anticipated violence happening that day based on what they understood the Klan was doing, except that day when we went to a department store to sit in, we did not see any law enforcement officials. In fact, we never did during the 2 weeks of the demonstrations. And 200 whites attacked any Black person downtown and directed their violence at the youth council sitting in. They had intended according to the report from the FBI informant, the Klan had intended to start a race war in Jacksonville. The white press, the two television stations, and the local daily newspaper blacked out all news, or whited out all news, as I say, about the sit-ins. There were reporters in town from other cities, from other states, who are reporting back to their viewers and to their readers but the only journalistic periodical was a black weekly newspaper reporting on the sit-ins. And of course, being weekly, you only got weekly news. You missed some of the intervening. It did a good job of catching up, but you missed that day-to-day reporting, which the local news media decided that they would not report on. Later that year, after Axe Handle Saturday, I met A. Philip Randolph and I met Roy Wilkins. Got a picture with Roy Wilkins, which is on a public art mural in Jacksonville that focuses on the title of my book, A Black Shopper Downtown who was just downtown shopping on August 27th and was beaten by 4 or 5 whites with axe handles, and a picture of me and Roy Wilkins. And then that's on the side of a building, 40 feet by 50 feet. And on the front of the building is a picture of Mr. Pearson and an axe handle. That was voted the #1 public art in Jacksonville earlier this year. So anyway, that brings you up to date on some of the actions that occurred when I was 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16.
Right. I wonder for young people watching this, if you could speak a little bit to your mindset. I mean, considering the intensity of the hatred you were experiencing, people yelling at you, sticking you with pins. I know you got stepped on with a high heel.
So you have read my first book.
How difficult was it to maintain that dedication to nonviolence in the face of all of that?
One of the differences when I nominated Mr. Pearson to the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame and he was voted into the Hall of Fame, I said when I nominated him, and I said afterwards, that Mr. Pearson was the thread that sewed together the civil rights movement. And he was not at the time when he was teaching 8th grade American history. But when he said, if you're not a part of the solution, you're a part of the problem, and that freedom is not free, at an impressionable age of 11. But still old enough as a youngster, as a preteen, to internalize the degradation of racism and segregation and bigotry and discrimination and all of the adjectives used to make sure that Blacks as marginalized folk were still thought of as property, as we were during that period of enslavement called slavery. And that fighting racism through sitting in made me a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And to have my 8th grade American history school teacher, also the advisor to the Youth Council, NAACP, it was a bridge from one to the other. 8th grade American history, 9th grade civics. When I went to high school, got in trouble in my first day in a history class when when the problems in American democracy teacher, Black teacher, still segregation, said something which was not correct. And I tried to, as much as I could, correct her without saying she was incorrect. And she got upset and sent me to the office. Luckily, I had some teachers at my high school who took up for me, and the solution was, since this was an elective class, for me to withdraw from, to get another elective class and no longer take problems in American democracy. And I talked about that, and I gave the example of what she said in the class and how I tried to collect her. And all of the teachers I spoke with, including Mr. Pearson, said, yeah, she was wrong. The question is, how do you as a student tell a teacher that he or she is wrong? But that resonated. I mean, going to the Penn Center at St. Helena Islands, and they called me the kid. I was the youngest person there. Even though chronologically I was in the same grade, if you will, or within a year or two of some of these college students. I went there when I was 11, when I was in 11th grade. But I knew enough about listening to keep my mouth closed and to listen to them, and only interject one or two things at the time. So all of that was part of a learning experience during these days of abject racism. As a young Black student, wanting to understand and internalize and realize and deal with the fact that why am I treated the way I'm treated just based on the color of my skin? So that's, all of that resonated with me. And my parents, though my mother was anxious after Axe Handle Saturday, she never said stop. I had a number of my friends then and later on as adults, basic Black friends, basically say to me, you know, Rodney, I would have wanted to be with the Youth Council, but my mother, my father, my parents said, no, you don't bother that. Leave them, let them do whatever they're gonna do. You're not gonna be a part of it. It could impact our job, my job, our living status. But it was important enough that Mr. Pearson taught me a lot about who I was with my Black hue of skin, the contributions made by Black folk in this country prior to slavery, after slavery, and that no one gave me anything. Because if you read an American history textbook and you don't see where there were what we know now are many, many contributions, salient contributions to the American way of life that we internalize today, not even knowing. It was important enough for Mr. Pearson to teach us so that we could understand contributions by folk who look like us. So in our mind, the playing field was leveled. It was no longer uneven. When you realize that a textbook that had more than 300 pages in it only had 2 Black names in the entire history of this country. And for us to study and read about and do book reports on and get letters from those persons making a difference, it made a difference with us. It made a difference with me. So at age 11, I started my journey on understanding who I am, understanding Black history, knowledge of Black history, understanding civil rights history, knowledge of civil rights history. And that was 66 years ago.
When the Jacksonville sit-ins were happening, this was only a couple of months before John F. Kennedy was elected president. As a young person, can you give me a sense of what you thought of Kennedy at that time?
Well, we followed the election, even though we were not voting. John Kennedy did come to Jacksonville. Also in 1960, when he was elected, which was the year of the sit-ins, John Kennedy very famously said in a speech that he thinks that people should stand up for their rights and where necessary, sit down for them also. And also Martin Luther King was arrested that year, late in that year, 1960. And as the history goes, John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy got Martin Luther King out of jail. Nixon did not respond at all. So we watched that and understand in this period in American history, even if the white person were a moderate white person, during these times, he sounded like a liberal white person. Just to say the right things because they were the right things to say and do the right things because they were the right things to do made many of us embrace Robert Kennedy. And of course, in elections, we internalized and understood, even prior to our electing, being able to vote, that you, given only white candidates running, that you learn in studying their record to support the lesser of evils as it related to the Black community. And certainly John F. Kennedy was considered far and away the lesser of the evils of 2 white males running for the president of these as yet United States of America.
Let's go back to Carswell, where you mentioned you were stationed in 1963. Tell me about November when President and Mrs. Kennedy visited Fort Worth, if you would.
Well, prior to that, when I went through Lackland in 61, I had good grades and you got training assignments based on the entry-level test that you took going into the military. So they called from the squadron I was in, they called several names, and we went to a room, and I'd been a Boy Scout, so I knew Morse code, and this was a room that dealt with Morse code, and you took a test, more or less a perfunctory test, because they figured you would pass, and you were going to be assigned to a training school. And prior to we taking the test, one of the airmen asked the sergeant giving the test where the training was. And the sergeant said, Keesler Air Force Base. Well, I knew Keesler Air Force Base was in Biloxi, Mississippi, because prior to my joining the Air Force, there had been a couple of situations in the town of Biloxi with Black airmen who were stationed at Keesler. Plus, I was supposed to go and speak in the state of Mississippi sometimes after Axe Handle Saturday. I was invited out by Medgar Evers and Aaron Henry with the NAACP in Mississippi, and Roy Wilkins later called Mrs. Ruby Hurley, who was the regional director of the NAACP, who was spending time in Jacksonville, and told her that he would not recommend that I go to Mississippi because the NAACP could not protect me if I went to Mississippi to speak. So when the sergeant said Keesler Air Force Base, I determined I was not going to pass that test because I was not going to go to Keesler. And luckily my grades in overall grades were good enough that they sent me to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas for the Air Force new computer training punch card accounting machine process. They were converting over everything from manual to punch cards with the punch card machine and the verifying, the sorter and the machine that would print them all up. So I went to Shepherd Air Force Base for training, was there for about 14 weeks. After that, I was assigned to Carswell. Permanent party at Carswell, 30 miles from Dallas, Texas. Cowboys had started in 1960. The Dallas Texans played a lot of their games in Fort Worth. When I got there in 1961, I got there too late for the 61 football season, but in 62, we got tickets to all of the home Dallas Cowboy games. You had to wear your uniform. We went over in an Air Force bus, and we were between the 40-yard line. Because I was a patrol when I was in elementary school and initially in junior high school, I knew how to march. From tech school, tech training in Wichita Falls, I was both a squadron leader and a right guide, because every day you had to march in parade and training school to your training classes. So you had to assemble on the parade grounds and you had to march irrespective of the heat in Texas during the summer. And also at Carswell, we would have monthly parades, mostly for the generals. We shared a flight line with Convair General Dynamics at that time. So all of this was part of what the military does. And Carswell was a strategic air command base. We had B-52s and B-58s. Had an excellent flight line. A lot of your key mechanics in the country came to Carswell because the B-52s and the B-58s at that time were the major planes that we had in the Air Force. When we would get U-2s in, U-2s would come in around midnight and they would go straight to a hangar protected by the air police. And when a U-2 plane would leave, they would leave also in the dead of night. The job that I had at Carswell in Stat Services was related to the mission of support, mostly of the B-52s and B-58s. And when we had to deal with the maintenance on a special plane that came in, there was a coded word for them and a coded number for them And obviously we knew who and what it was. So I was out there, if you will, in terms of recognition and on several honor guards. So when President Kennedy came in the night before, and we did not know, we being those of us at Carswell Air Force Base, we did not know that Air Force One was going to land at Carswell, and they would have a motorcade from Carswell to the Worth Hotel in downtown Fort Worth. And it was not until the next day, and I did not work on the flight line, but all of my work was airplane related. So the security clearance that I had allowed me to go to the flight line whenever I needed to go. So it was quite unique for us to be on the flight line and see Air Force One, which I saw earlier that morning. Then I got a call from at least my squadron, my NCOIC, the non-commissioned officer in charge, called me and said that I was going to be on honor detail duty when the president came in. So I had to go home, go back to my barracks, to my dormitory, change into what we call dress blues, then report to the flight line. So when President Kennedy came in from downtown Fort Worth, instead of the motorcade and his car going directly to the stairs leading up to Air Force One, his car came over by a roped off area. They had announced and they had called different duty stations at Carswell and said that dependents and persons working, I mean, after all, the president is commander-in-chief, that they would be allowed to come on the flight line, which are obviously and ordinarily they would not be. So by the time the president got there late morning, there was a throng of folk, dependents, young children, wives and military persons, all on the flight line behind a rope. The plane is 40, 50 feet away. And the president had his car come over to the rope to those persons there. And he got out and just started shaking hands. And he must have done that 30 or 40 minutes. Now, we were, as part of the honor detail, our job, our responsibility was to be there as he walked up the ramp or I can't remember. It wasn't carpet that they had down, but something akin to that he walked on before he got on the steps to go up to the plane. And we would stand there and salute him as he walked by, and he shook our hands. So we were prepared to do that, but now he's shaking hands with the crowd. So we've got to wait, which obviously we didn't mind doing it because it was a thrill for a lot of people to be there to shake the hands of the president, even though we were in Texas, even though he had been in office for a little over 2 years, and a lot of people didn't particularly like his so-called social justice stances. We had the March on Washington that year in '63. So there were a lot of things going on in terms of this country, and Texas was still Texas. So then when, under whatever circumstances, he left shaking hands, still shook for a long time. Then he came and they the car then drove him around to the plane, got out, shook our hands, walked up the stairs into Air Force One. We went back to our duty section. Everybody was ecstatic, talking about whatever. And within an hour of the time he went up the stairs to the plane, he was dead. When we heard the news, they shut down the base, our base. They shut it down. All of our work activities were suspended. And we knew the hospital, Parkland Hospital, where they took him to. Obviously, you're familiar with that. I had been at Carswell long enough where it was just a hop and a skip ride from Fort Worth to Dallas. So we knew where Parkland Hospital was, but we also knew that he was shot in the head. And it did not take much before you understood, even though the terminology was not the same, and even though you held out hope that it was a flesh wound or it was not anything that was a mortal wound, but you pretty well knew that he was going to die. When the word filtered through on all of the television stations that had gone to this reporting, we had reporters at Carswell, and obviously we saw folk reporting from Dealey Plaza, and I can remember there was a Hurst sign that had a time there that sometimes, and I can't remember if we would see it going to the Cotton Bowl or whenever, but sometimes we would pass that, I think. And we would always know, because we would always get there early enough for Dallas football game. But again, we were in between the 40-yard line. So we were familiar with Dealey Plaza, and we were familiar with that Hurt sign. Except Dealey Plaza is not a place that you would have anticipated would have been the site of the planning of an assassination. You know, as wide open as it was, we never looked at the Texas Book Depository as being anything unique. But it did happen. And of course, we were shut down. Nothing went on. The foreign powers could have bombed America during that time frame, and we would not have been prepared because of, I mean, just the anger, the sadness. And when I say anger, we had fights on Carswell. We had some white airmen who said, good. We had fights in my barracks between blacks and whites. You know, Texas was still Texas then. I know there were also reports that teachers announced to their elementary classes that President Kennedy was killed, and according to news reports, kids applauded that he was dead. So just graduate that up some years for those of us who were in the military, and it was tense. I mean, when I say fights and tense, I mean where the air police, the APs, had to start patrolling portions of Carswell, and even came into some of the barracks, came into our barracks up in the day room where we had television, and where there were lots of bloody noses and black eyes, and abrasions and persons pushed down stairwells. And I mean, all of this went on Carswell Air Force Base after President Kennedy was killed.
That's extraordinary. In the day room watching the TV, I suppose you were able to follow Oswald's arrest, Oswald's shooting, and then the funeral that Monday, all those events that took place over those 4 days.
Yeah, and we knew about Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby had one of the, what we called at that time, a titty bar. And I think it was called the Colt 45 or something like that. It was on a major thoroughfare in downtown Dallas. So he was not, I mean, we didn't know about any other involvement he had. Certainly no one knew that he was going to go into the Dallas Police Department building and shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. But we knew after he did that, we knew who he was. We didn't get back to normal at Carswell until well after President Kennedy's. Year before that, in '62, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we got B-52s, we've got B-58s. We had sent B-52s and B-58s to the state of Florida. They were at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. They were down at Homestead. We were prepared to bomb Cuba out of existence. I mean, pilots of B-52s and B-58s were brought back on base, Carswell Air Force Base. We were not allowed to wear civilian uniforms. You know, you wore your Air Force fatigues and other military uniforms during your 7 or 7:30 to 4:30 work day. And then you could, when you went back to your barracks, your dormitories, even walking around the base, going to the movie, going to the bowling alley, NCO club, officers club, which you were allowed to do on selected days during the month, really just to drink alcohol, which you could do on the base, even if you were, I mean, under 21. But we were not allowed to wear civilian clothes, period, during this time. Again, they brought the pilots back on base. Pilots, families could only come visit them on Sundays. And every day a group of pilots would go to a different base, prepared on a moment's notice to get into a B-52 or B-58 headed toward Cuba or wherever else. I mean, we were as close to war as anything that I could have imagined or read about as you read about these historical perspectives of what happened and how they happened. So a zig and a zag here and there in '62, you know, we could have gone. So a year later, we were accustomed to the trauma of things being out of the ordinary at Carswell, but not to this degree. Not only is the president dead, but the commander-in-chief is dead. And the reason he's dead, as far as Black folk were concerned, was because of racism. And as far as some white folk were concerned, was because he was doing too much for the niggers and he needed to be dead. I mean, there's no loss because he was killed. Of course, no one banked on Lyndon Johnson being Lyndon Johnson. He was no longer the head of the manipulative head in the body politic of Congress, but he now could twist arms the same way he could twist them when he was in Congress, but a little different this time because he had the weight of all of the federal government going for him. So So that was interesting. But those 2 years, 62 and 63, represented quite the contrast. They were the same in some regards, but they were totally different in others, because 62 represented military might and confrontation. 63 represented, for me, racism and segregation and white racists getting back at a so-called liberal president. So it was the same in many regards, but it was also very different in the same way.
Having spent some time in Fort Worth and Dallas, how did segregation here compare to what you had experienced in Jacksonville and elsewhere as you would visit the Deep South?
No different, because of what I did in the Air Force with punch card machines and verifiers. Several of my friends, 2 of us were Black, 4 were white. We did some work for the Ben Hogan Company, which was in Fort Worth, on a part-time basis. So when they contacted this guy who had been doing some part-time work, and he gave them the names of some of us who were doing the same thing he was doing, they hired us sight unseen just to do part-time work. It wasn't until later we worked from like 6 to 9 for 3 or 4 nights a week. It wasn't until later when one of the work supervisors came in and saw there were 2 Blacks as a part of these 6 military. Didn't say anything, not to us, but did raise a few eyebrows. 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, I went to hear Opal Lee speak here in Jacksonville. Opal Lee was the Black female who is given credit for moving the Juneteenth holiday, and which was signed this year by President Biden as a national holiday. I met her when I was in the Air Force, both at an NAACP meeting and at Terrell High School in Fort Worth. I remembered her because of the issue. She didn't remember me because I was just one of a number. She remembered both events. She's 94 now. But I got a chance to talk to her, and we got a chance to reminisce about those days almost 60 years ago. At her ripe old age, I said 94, she turned 95 last month. So Fort Worth and Dallas, I ended up knowing some of the Dallas Texans. One of my real, as a fan, I met Abner Haynes, who was at the time one of the key running backs for the Texans. 1964, as a future draft pick, the Cowboys drafted Bob Hayes, who from Jacksonville went to Florida A&M, became an image of athletic prowess in the 1964 Summer Olympics in Tokyo, Japan, winning the 100-meter dash in world record time and anchoring the 400-meter dash in next to last place, and by all accounts, running the fastest ankle leg in the history of the Summer Olympics. Cowboys signed him as a future. 65, in 64 rather, I knew Bob in Jacksonville. He graduated the same year I did from high school. So I knew him. And I recognized that there was a group and he was signing autographs and whatever else. And I passed by him with some of the airmen. We were going back to the bus, and I called him by a Jacksonville community nickname. And when he heard that name, he immediately said, somebody from Jacksonville. So the guys I'm with, even though I'm from Jacksonville, and I said, I knew Bob Hayes. You don't know Bob Hayes, you're just saying that because you're all from the same city. And we stood there and talked for about 5 or 10 minutes about some of his friends at A&M and the Cowboys and what's Dallas like? I mean, all of these things he wanted to know from me as we talked about that. I could have stayed in Fort Worth, in the Fort Worth, Dallas area, and I could have gotten a job. I had 2 offers along, they called it Miracle Mile. I don't know what they call it now, where there were a number of Fortune 500 companies along this stretch of highway. But I decided to come back to Jacksonville because whatever I needed to fight, I would just as soon fight it in my hometown. So I came back to Jacksonville.
You mentioned Lyndon Johnson a few minutes ago, and I would love to hear your thoughts on Johnson's motivations for pushing through the Civil Rights Act and then voting rights. Johnson's overall legacy in your eyes with the civil rights legislation on one hand and Vietnam on the other. What do you think of Johnson today?
Well, I think Lyndon Johnson should go down, probably won't, but should go down as one of America's greatest presidents. A lot of people just have never internalized what came out of the Great Society programs and that 1964 Civil Rights Act, and even though a Civil Rights Bill, and even though it was passed by Congress, you had Medicare and Medicaid that came out of that. You had Head Start that came out of that through OEO programs. 65 Voting Rights Act, 68 Voting Rights Act. So some of the things that Lyndon Johnson did were just absolutely classic. We have such a sanitized interpretation and impression of war. And part of that is because the media, through whatever code, does not report on war to Americans the way war is reported in European countries and some of the other places. War is designed to kill people. War is designed to destroy a country and bring that country to its knees. When we dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we didn't do it because we were trying to make diplomatic amends and make a diplomatic statement. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the intent was to incur as much death and damage on this country as possible. And we returned the favor. The problem with Vietnam is that many people don't know why we were there. It's hard to internalize whatever it is you're fighting for in a country that you know very little about and know very little intel about. For instance, we invented Agent Orange, and Agent Orange was a napalm type substance designed to destroy the foliage. Anything green in Vietnam, napalm, Agent Orange destroyed it. And the feeling was they are hiding in this foliage, in the trees and in the brush. If we destroy all the trees and destroy all the brush, then they wouldn't have any place to hide, the Vietnamese in their own country. They wouldn't have any place to hide because we've destroyed all the hiding places, and we can bring this war to a much easier end. And nobody told these learned generals that the Viet Cong had hundreds, if not thousands of miles of tunnels throughout their country. So we destroyed the foliage and they just went underground. We didn't know about the underground tunnels. Lyndon Johnson is a great president, notwithstanding the fact that this country got on its high and mighty horse about Vietnam. I don't say that as a veteran. I say that just based on common sense. If you're fighting a war, you're fighting a war. You don't fight a nice war. You don't fight and do some things one day. I think that Robert McNamara and some of the others use sleight of hand to escalate the war. The Gulf of Tonkin, for instance, Gulf of Tonkin happened in '64. I am a Vietnam era veteran, even though I actually spent 90 days at Clark Air Base in the Philippines processing folk into the Vietnam War and out of the Vietnam War. I was never in war-torn Vietnam. But I consider Lyndon Johnson a great president. I don't know of another president who's ever said, "and we shall overcome." So I respect him and I honor him and his memory and what he did based on the fact that there were some things that he could do and he did them with his knowledge of Congress and his seated position as President of the United States, fulfilling an unexpired term and then being elected to a term on his own. So Lyndon Johnson is one of my favorite presidents.
For young people watching this recording, thinking of your activism more than 60 years ago, what words of wisdom or advice do you have for young people now and in the future who are engaged in activism?
There are those who would say that because you can't see the signs, that overt racism is not there. And all we have to do is look around us to see that the overt racism is still there. You don't have to walk a picket line or march or demonstrate. There are a number of things you can do. I've got a friend, and I wrote about her in my second book. She's a Quaker, and she got upset because the Coca-Cola company supported apartheid in South Africa. She stopped drinking Coca-Cola products. And she stopped eating table grapes because of the industry and how it impacted Cesar Chavez and migrant workers. So there are a number of things that you can do. They don't have to be the big things. You can join an organization. You can contribute to something. But you've got to do something. Doing nothing is not an option, especially when we understand how this country and other consuming companies have abused their people and also abused the land and also abused the climate. So there are things that you have to do. No one can plot a course or a path that you must follow or that you should follow to make a difference. If you think this country does not need to change its philosophies, if you think that everything is fine, if you think as a young white person that if you don't do anything, you will be able to inherit through your white privilege and white racism a world of tomorrow that would be materially beneficial to you, then do nothing. If you think as a Black person, young Black person, that if you maintain an existence as a bent back Negro, that things will accrue to you because you are not rocking the boat and you are not talking about uncomfortable subjects with your white friends, associates, and coworkers, then continue to be a bent back Negro. And if you can sleep well at night, white person, Black person, then continue to do what you're doing. But if you understand what's happening in this country and what's happening to you and what has happened to you as a young person, if you want that to continue to happen to your children and your children's children, then continue to do what you're doing. If you want to change that, then you've got to get in the fray somewhere. And no one can tell you how to get in the fray. No one can tell you what you need to do in that fray. No one can tell you not to support climate change. I would imagine when many of the young persons, when they, by the time they are ready to buy a car, their choices will be with a lot of electric cars. They've got some sexy looking electric cars these days. And if I bought another car at my age, then I certainly would buy one. And that would do a whole lot in terms of the pollutants in the air. And won't do anything for those who've invested in gas stock, but it would do a lot in terms of life, longevity, and happiness. So doing nothing is never an option. Doing nothing is not something that we say, well, I think things are fine. Let me just move right on and do nothing. Many young people who are the future brain trust of tomorrow, many of them are decision makers. They don't have to be crowd followers. Those persons who make a difference in this country did not decide they were going to make a difference by following someone else. All of the movements, even in the civil rights movement, every portion of the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s were started by, all portions were started by young people. And even though I was 16, some of the four Black males that started the sit-in demonstrations in Greensboro, North Carolina, from North Carolina A&T on February 1st, 1960. The oldest one was 20 years old. When I first met John Lewis, he was 18. When I first met James Bevel and Diane Nash, they were in their early 20s, 21. So young people have always played an important part. The young people from Marjorie Rawlings High, who have been on a crusade against gun control. The young girl from Europe, what's her name, Thunberg? Mm-hmm. And that might not be her name. I might, for whatever reason, having a senior moment about her name. She's talking about climate change. In fact, she very famously said that this climate change conference that everyone is touting the successes of, she's already called that a sham. And you don't stop young people from their opinions. If they are right or if they're wrong, they will find out. If they're right, obviously move forward. If they're wrong, they will find out how wrong they are. Some things they will get with age. Some things they will get through trial and error. Some things they will get with adults helping them along. But many of the things that they will do because they know it's the right thing to do. So a lot of young folk have decisions to make. No one can hold their hand and say, you need to do this or this. They are young enough and old enough to know what is honest and know the difference between right and wrong and to understand truth. I call many people in the civil rights movement committed truth tellers. And that's all that you want people to do, be it about American history, be it about issues, no matter whatever it is. Just tell the truth about it. And that's what we want many young people, I would want many young people to be today, as I have met in my lifetime, and as I think I am, a committed truth teller. And if you tell the truth, if you're honest about certain things, believe it or not, other things will fall into place.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. It has been a tremendous pleasure and honor to get to talk with you today and add your story to this archive of the 1960s. Is there anything that we haven't talked about? Any other final words that you'd like to share before we wrap this up?
No, not really. A lot of us don't understand as you live through moments, how important it is to just take inventory as you're living through some things. A lot of times we take so many things for granted, historical moments. As I set my son and my nephew and others down when we went to the inauguration of Barack Obama. And even as I take inventory on myself when I was out in Texas, the swings during my 4 years in Fort Worth between great football teams and a war effort almost, and a president being killed and another president coming in right after him. When you live through that, you have to be able to internalize for yourself first and then retell the story. We have a lot of young people who are living through some of the most dangerous times of American history and whatever is called American democracy. And they've got to be able to internalize what they want and what they are seeing. And I know we are prone in many instances, people say, believe me and not your lying eyes, instead of looking at, I mean, this thing with the vaccine today is one of the most ridiculous things I've heard of in the 1950s. Polio had ravaged young people throughout this country. And it was not a question if. They scheduled us at my elementary school, and one day we walked from the elementary school over to a Black church, and we got our jab in the arm and we walked back. And then later on, and I don't remember the exact time frame, that was the Salk vaccine. Later on, we took the Sabin vaccine, which you took orally in a sugar cube. Took both of them, a shot and the vaccine, and it was not a question of if. When you saw the pictures of young children with these heavy iron crutches and laying flat on their back, and the only way they could communicate is look in a mirror that was above this iron lung that they were in, which enabled them to breathe. And you see people who've been intubated and with tubes in their mouths and in their nose. And some of them have realized that they put their life and their families' lives at risk because being amazingly stupid about their health and the vaccine. And yet it continues to happen day to day. It's been polarized and politicized in such a way where it's just absolutely ridiculous. Learn how young people to make independent decisions that will make a difference. Understanding that the first thing you've got to do is make sure you take care of yourself first. Climate control, gun control, health services, you got to take care of yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anyone else. And I know that young people feel they're invulnerable, that nothing is ever going to happen to them. That sounds good, but that's not medical fact, as we have seen with this pandemic and other things. But because I was there, even though it was eons ago, I support young people making their own decisions. And sometimes they aren't going to get it right, but many times they will. And if we allow them to really think about what their future represents, not only for themselves, but their children and their grandchildren, they really internalize that. I think going forward, they'll make some of the right decisions.